Sweden is inevitably impacted by the choices of its neighbors, and Swedish defense policy have reflected the military dominance of it. Sweden has for the past 200 years employed armed neutrality, which ensures its neutrality by making any conflict with it too costly for any potential invader. This has resulted in the longest series of peace in Swedish history, as Sweden's last war was in 1814. Sweden's neighbors has not always fared as good though, as both Denmark and Norway fell to German invasions in World War II. Likewise, Finland was engrossed in a costly war with the Soviet Union, and while Sweden housed their respective governments in exile, sent tens of thousands of volunteers to fight alongside Finland, there was also a huge limiting factor in their neutrality, and some felt that a war could have been avoided for all of the Nordic countries if the Nordic countries stood together as one in the first place. That Sweden's armed neutrality had allowed it to be too much of a spectator in an increasingly international world, which allowed it to fail to protect its interests beyond its national borders around the Baltic. You see, Sweden controls the most geopolitically important island in Northern Europe, Gotland, which is centered right in the middle of the Baltic Sea. From it, much of Northern Europe naval activity can easily be intercepted by naval attacks, artillery or other means. Missiles from Gotland can easily reach all of the Baltic states, as you see here on this picture, and Poland and Russian Kaliningrad, as well as the Estonia, Norway. It's the ideal position for any attack or defensive attack in the Baltic Ocean. Likewise, most ferries and sea traffic pass close by Gotland, either to the west or to the right. And those that don't pass there pass by other NATO countries for the most part, with the exception of Finland. In recent years, the question of joining NATO has resurfaced as Russia again has applied military force in the post-Soviet era. First in Georgia in 2008, where Russia, in order to stop Georgian accession to NATO and punish their pulling away from Russia, as well as some of the more local issues that I won't go into, propped up the breakaway republics of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. This shattered the view in Sweden of a changed Russia, and in many ways created the view that Putin and the Russian government would use force whenever and however it pleased. This view solidified later with the civil unrest in Ukraine around Euromaidan in Ukraine when Russia annexed Crimea, which was described in Swedish media as the first forced border change in a post-World War II Europe. But Swedish security is not just concerned with those foreign debattles, there's also been much more close-by crises. Russian submarines and airplanes have consistently been found to cross Swedish sea and air borders yearly, which has heightened both fears of Russian attacks and Swedish capabilities. These very capabilities was in a report from the military chief commander estimated to be able to hold back a Russian invasion for only 1 week, resulting in momentary panic and lots of press coverage. Sweden has since raised military spending and militarized Gotland, but in real terms the situation has only mildly changed. After this, the government, after a series of parliamentary negotiation rounds, put the topic of NATO membership on hold by doing an inquiry in 2015. The objective of the study was to, based on an independent perspective, analyze and account for the consequences of Swedish NATO membership, advantages and disadvantages, inquire with other countries and organizations in the field of defense and security policy, and come to a conclusion. While the conclusion of the study has been greatly debated, there has also been some more clear coverage from this. We've received confirmation that Norway, Germany, Denmark, and the United States all want Sweden in the alliance, and we've also seen more clarity on the pros and cons for Sweden itself. Some of the pros for Sweden was found to be increased military cooperation and defense guarantees. We would know for sure that NATO would come to Swedish defense if there ever was a crisis, rather than the idea of that they might. Furthermore, we would have access to NATO information, be able to streamline and cooperate in a way that we'd never be able to before. Further on this, there would be a clarity on where Sweden stands in a crisis, and this would enable planning for a whole Baltic cooperation and policy rather than a forceful make it up as you go policy, and hopefully an end to Russian border teasing as a consequence of this. There will be a lot more cooperation on cybersecurity, which has been a lot more recent issue, as seen as much as this month with the big hacking of Sweden's biggest grocery store that's crippled much of their attack and kept them closed for a couple days. There will also be increased ease in military matters, as they're now both part of NATO and the EU in military matters, uniting almost all of the Nordic countries, with the exception of Finland, which, as we'll talk about later, will likely join as well if Sweden were ever to join. The cons for Sweden would be that there would be a worsened relations with Russia and an increased target for anti-NATO and American rhetoric and propaganda. Sweden would have clearly aligned itself with the West in a matter that it hasn't done right now in a more clear-cut way. Sure, Sweden has always kind of softly allied with the West, and this has been one more agreement at the time of recent years and over the whole Cold War. But it hasn't been part of NATO. Sweden would also be now a potential missile target in a potential all-out war. It'd have slightly worsened trade ties with Russia, but no significant impact as it's all in the greater European Union, custom union. And it will also have an obligation to help fellow NATO countries in a crisis, which is seen as more likely than Sweden being affected. Some of the more mixed ideas is that there will be pressure on Sweden to raise military spending, but this is something that most parties want to do anyway, so it's not seen as a wholly negative thing, except for the left party. Now, for NATO, it would secure the most strategic island in the Baltic and make it an almost completely NATO-dominated sea. There would no longer be a need to improvise in the case of a crisis in the Baltic, but instead collective planning could be done. A geopolitical vacuum would be filled, so to speak. They would have increased manpower and financial support. They've had the addition of an international respected nation as a NATO member. And it would likely lead to Finland joining NATO as well, as the understanding between Finland and Sweden has always been that if one joins, the other one will as well, as only one of them being neutral does not make geopolitical sense, and this is confirmed in treaties, understandings between the respective governments, as well between the respective populations. Finally, it doesn't carry any risk of military escalation with Russia in the same way that an accession of Ukraine or Georgia would do. There really is no con for NATO, and that is more a case for Sweden. Overall, I would say that joining NATO from a Swedish perspective is more of a mixed bag. It can be seen as positive, and they would have a backup and the support from the rest of NATO, whereas for joining NATO, it's exclusively positive. As is so often the case, politically expedient and the most attractive nations for you to ally with aren't interested in allying with you. Thank you. This is Leo from The Swedish Historian. Goodbye.